From the Alvin and Rosalie Sarachek studio, PBS Kansas presents Kansas Week.
We're hitting the road and the rails this week, ranging from Tesla sales to Union Pacific trying to get out of a lawsuit over a chemical spill in Wichita. Not to mention the chances of the Heartland Flyer taking off from central Kansas down to Fort Worth, Texas, now that the project has federal approval. That's just some of what we're talking about right now on Kansas Week. This is Kansas Week, and I'm your host, Pilar Pedraza. We'll get to all those stories in a bit, but we're starting with a story that has most of Kansas talking this week and half of you up in arms. The planned changes to the state license plates. After a united cry of outrage over the first released design, the state came up with 5 more for you to vote on. Polls closed a couple hours ago, but you sure had a lot of opinions about the designs, as you told KSN's Craig Andrus.
I know the one that they posted about, the one you talking about, the original, or the one that's supposed to replace, that is ugly, but hopefully they go with something else.
Indeed, the state is going in a new direction now with 5 different design choices that are meant to reflect Kansas.
I mean, we've had some things at some times with the weed in them and little things here and there, but nothing that really represents our cities. A lot that represents the countryside or typical things outsiders may think about Kansas.
JD wants to see some city designs from across the state on the plate, like skylines in the metro.
I think they could do a little bit more with that. And we have all this blank space in here where you could really highlight a lot of the culture, a lot of Kansas in the background of the deal.
Other Kansans have mixed thoughts on those new design choices.
You know, I think I would pick number 3.
It's pretty outlandish. It's pretty garish. I don't know what was wrong with the old one. I really don't.
But a new plate is on the way, and you can go vote on one of those 5 designs created by a marketing company that is already on retainer from the state of Kansas. Meanwhile, some say showing Kansas wheat is just fine, but maybe a city theme would be a little more modern.
A lot that represents the countryside or typical things outsiders may think about Kansas, but nothing that really brings it to what we produce, what we do in Kansas outside of agriculture.
Here for you, Craig Andrus, KSN News 3.
And again, the voting has now closed. That was a story from earlier in the week. Here to take a look at why we feel so strongly about a license plate and a lot more this week. We've got with us Dr. Neil Allen, a political scientist from Wichita State University, as well as Sherdell Berthet, a local community activist, and Dr. Michael Smith from Emporia State University. Thank you all so much for being here. And I'm going to throw this out as our first discussion line. Why do we care about this so much?
Well, we're a very car-dependent society. The United States in general, but certainly Kansas. You know, we live with our cars to a very great extent. I think also one thing about complicated political issues like Medicaid expansions or something like that, taxes, pick your topic, they're really complicated. They'll have all these twists and turns, and the bills are hundreds of pages long, and federal law, state law. License plates are something we see every day. We see hundreds of them. And so even though it's probably not the most important thing going on right now, it can provoke a really strong reaction because it's not so complicated.
Tell me about complicated. I've got to explain that complicated in a minute and a half most days. What do you think, Neil? Why do we care so much?
Well, I mean, Michael's right that, you know, so many of us spend time in our cars. Often it's boring to be in the car. And also you're looking, hopefully, at other cars so you can defensively drive and not hit those cars. And a lot of the reason for the redesign in the first place is to make it easier to see, especially for law enforcement. And also, I just wish in Kansas we would think a little more broadly about our license plates. One, like, yes, to the stars is part of the state motto, but we really could get by with less stuff called ad astra in this state. And also, we should have front license plates because that's safer, because the police can see a car from the front as well as the back. And I mean, we would have to give up the right to like tell each other what to eat, like eating beef. And also, people drive around in this town with license plates on the front from different states, particularly North Carolina, because they like being first in flight. But that gives the wrong idea about who that car is. And it's not the most important thing. And if we want to have a vote on it, that's fine. And also, Kansas, we do have cities, but not with identifiable skylines. So a bunch of numbers and letters, wheat, says Kansas, as long as the cops can read it and pull over somebody need to pull over, then we should just get a new plate and get going on down the road.
And we do know that there was one issue with the K-tags. I did a story about it last year about folks, because we have an issue where more than one license plate will have the same number in Iowa State, showing my roots there. Yes, I'm an Iowa State grad. A Wichita State or ICT plate and a KU alumni plate, because they have their different specialty plates, can have the same number in Kansas. But when they get out onto the cashless tolling, they can't always tell the difference, and that's becoming more and more of an issue these days.
Well, I think if we be just really clear as to, we can be opinionated for one, but why it's important. And I think what you just made reference to is something that we definitely should take into consideration from the legal aspects of it. As far as Dr. Neal, as you make reference to having the front tax, we're killing a lot of trees in one aspect, and I know it doesn't have a relationship anything as far as the tax is concerned because it's metal, but is that something that we really need to do? I think I like personally just having the one tag and just dealing with that, and it gives persons to personalize their vehicles a little bit more in the front here in Kansas, and I think Oklahoma is the same way as well too, and there's some other states as well too, but it's a matter of opinion.
Yeah. Okay, well, before we start another big license plate fight in the state here on the show, we're going to move on to our next topic. Kansans who want to see passenger rail service extend through Wichita down to Texas got a big win as the state got $500,000 to study the plan. As KSN's Derek Lytle shows us, it's just one step in the process, but an important one.
They have to approve a route to be eligible for passenger rail. That's the big home run, is that now it is officially eligible.
Sedgwick County Commissioner Pete Meissner says the big win is receiving Corridor ID approval. This unlocks 80% of funding for the extension to come from the federal level, something that wasn't approved when the concept was looked at in 2011, leaving Oklahoma and Kansas to match at 10%.
That was the opportunity to say, all right, let's really dust this off and see if we can go after it.
The Kansas Department of Transportation says a few adjustments will have to be made to operate passenger trains that run at 79 miles per hour.
Whether it's added track capacity or track infrastructure improvements that allow the passenger rail service to operate with the existing freight traffic.
Some advocates pushing for the expansion since the early 2000s not sold this plan will work.
Go round and round, year after year, decade after decade, with these studies, and the studies do not put trains on the rails. They are simply a beginning.
President of Passenger Rail Kansas, Evan Stair, is unsure the two states will commit to the funding to unlock the federal grant.
So Oklahoma and Kansas are going to have to somehow come up with $22 million in funding. That is our prediction.
KDOT plans to have the route operational by 2029.
And talking about coming up with that funding, everyone I have spoken to, of course, I've only spoken to Kansans working on this project, not to Oklahomans, but they seem to be very sure they have an agreement with Oklahoma, with Texas. It's just a matter of figuring out who puts how much money into it. Is that enough?
Well, we should think about, how poor our train access is in the middle of the United States. And, it would take billions and billions of dollars to get us anywhere near where the Europeans are. And that's really just even in the Northeast Corridor, which is the best served part of our country. But there's currently a line that goes from Dallas, or I guess technically Fort Worth, up to Oklahoma City. You have several trains a day. It's a great tourist draw for both metropolitan areas. The tracks go here. And also, it couldn't have worse timetables than the current train access we have just north of here in Wichita and Newton.
5 a.m.
I believe it's 3 o'clock a.m. going both directions.
Okay. You can tell I haven't ridden the train.
Yeah, well, I looked into actually taking a bunch of students to Chicago for last year, and we ended up not even being able to find enough seats for 20 of us, and it just makes sense. And and also right now we have an extremely pro-train by American Standards administration in Washington, and also in Kansas and Oklahoma we both have budget surpluses, So it seems like now's the time.
Well, I think when we talk about the environment, train be a strong vehicle to help us in that capacity. And then even our local economy as well too. I think that that would be a great connection for us with that Oklahoma-Kansas connection. So by all means.
I think one of the challenges you have is when you arrive at your destination. Our metros are so car dependent. I think this is a major reason why so many people drive on trips like that. When you get to Fort Worth, you still have to drive around to get places in Fort Worth. So they're going to need to tie that into public transportation, or they're going to need to have rental cars available if they really want to make a dent. But I do agree, not only driving a few people to a car, but also airplanes consume a lot of fuel. And that's the big difference in places like Europe and Asia, is that those kind of short hops, like Wichita to Fort Worth, they don't fly on an airplane for that. They take a train. And it does consume less fuel. So it's going to take some doing to make it work, but it's worth a try.
And also, if you think about it, from Wichita, we have lots of flights to Dallas-Fort Worth, and it's a hub that we connect through. But if you want to fly from here to Oklahoma City, you're going to have to fly to Dallas first, probably.
Well, one of the challenges we experience as far as our economy, I look at a lot of the corporations that we have lost, particularly here in our local area, had to do with the transportation budget. And so if we can do anything to help that to be even more efficient, it's going to be a plus for us.
Well, and I did want to bring up one thing. You mentioned transportation once you get there. And I don't know about other cities, but Chicago and Dallas in particular, they both actually have pretty well established public transit systems with subways that run fairly well, or the L in Chicago. Fort Worth isn't quite Dallas, but we've got Uber and Lyft now. It's not as bad as it used to be with some of these larger cities.
And that could make a big difference. I'm getting ready for a train trip to Chicago, and one of the things I really like about those trips is that when you go to the airport in a big city, it costs a fortune to get a ride-sharing service or a cab downtown. But most cities, I think this would be true of Wichita, the Union Station's right there in town. You get off, you're right downtown, and you can go wherever you want. And it saves money, but it also saves time and traffic.
The convenience.
Just a few of the benefits. South Central Kansans have talked about a lot of them, and you kind of touched on them as well, Shardell, of just the economics of connecting some of those cities, and not just Wichita to Chicago and Dallas, but the rest of Kansas. You know, we've got Dodge City, Liberal, those are also on that line.
Well, we start thinking about our population retention as well too. I mean, we've suffered a decline in our population, and so anything we can do to retain, particular skill sets, that's going to be a tremendous plus for us as a whole. And I could be an aid in doing that, I think.
I hope we also can get back to the days when travel is fun. People treat it as such a burden these days, and we just take for granted things that our great-grandparents wouldn't have been able to imagine. Train enthusiasts are really passionate about their hobby, and let's make travel fun again.
Yep. Traveling by train, having done it many times in Europe, can be a lot of fun.
Yeah, it really can.
Just get to sit back and relax and watch the countryside roll on by.
Okay. Well, I think there's a part of the countryside we're missing out on as well too, by not having that experience.
Yes, they don't call us flyover country for nothing.
Good point.
Union Pacific Railroad wants a lawsuit over a Wichita area chemical spill dismissed. But the Wichita say the railroad and the state hid the damage for decades. KAKE's Jocelyn Schifferdecker takes a look at Union Pacific's reasoning for asking the court to end the class action suit early.
Union Pacific is filing a motion to dismiss the federal class action lawsuit against it, saying it violates two Kansas laws because it wasn't filed within the proper time frame of 2 years since the accident took place.
They're not denying that they're the source of this contamination or that it has had an effect on the community at large, but they're simply trying to escape responsibility or shirk responsibility for what it is that they've done.
Chris Nidell, an environmental lawyer and one of the head attorneys representing two people who live in the affected area in northeast Wichita, disagrees, and he says Union Pacific needs to take accountability.
This is really about, human lives and the effect on real people that now have long suffered as a result of this contamination.
He thinks there are protections within the law that protect the community affected, and he is ready to fight for it.
We believe in our claim. We believe that this community was deceived.
The lawsuit filed in federal court says Union Pacific hid the presence of the contaminants and their release decades ago. It spread from the 29th and Grove environmental site to a large portion of a nearby neighborhood, causing decades worth of harm.
and you talk to families with a legacy of cancer and other health effects, that is likely the direct result of this irresponsible, negligent, reckless behavior on behalf of Union Pacific.
Nidell explains if any change were to come from this motion to dismiss, it would likely just be an amendment to the original complaint. He says he wants Union Pacific to stop hiding and take responsibility.
Union Pacific and their conduct from the past is the source of this contamination. This contamination needs to be cleaned up, and these people need to be compensated.
Now, we talk a lot about a neighborhood, but I want to throw a number out there that we really haven't heard a whole lot of. 13,000. Over 13,000 Wichitans are directly affected by this spill. I mean, that's huge. And
I thought the number was larger than that.
Well, the 13,000 is the number that they're trying to do health reviews with through Grace Med.
Okay.
So that's where I got that number. Certainly, you know, if you go back over the decades, there's certainly more than that for sure.
Absolutely.
And
Well,
we've lost a lot already.
Right, because there's also plenty of people that lived in that neighborhood for a period of time and now moved to other places.
Right.
And also, I mean, you know, for those that don't come to Wichita a lot or haven't been here, I mean, this is the poorest part of Kansas, one of the zip codes that's included here.
Yes.
I personally have lived on the edges of this area at about 5 different places in my 12 years here in Wichita. And also, it is true, I mean, the claim being made by Union Pacific is that this was public knowledge back as far as I think maybe 98. But also, when Union Pacific found out that they had dumped pollution into a neighborhood, it's their job to let people know. It's not the job of the people in that neighborhood to then go and find the right, I mean, it might have not even been on a state website at that point.
Websites didn't really exist yet.
and also, I mean, this is in a mainly African American neighborhood. That if this had happened a mile to the east or 2 miles to the south, which are higher income, you know, mixed and mostly white neighborhoods. I happen to live in one of them. You know, I'm pretty sure we would have heard about this 20 years ago, and you know, the lawyers who live in College Hill or East Wichita would have done something about this. But this neighborhood is not where the country clubs are. It's where most Wichitans only go through if they like to ride a bike through it or they live there. But it is unconscionable to have a major infrastructure company dumping poison and then not taking responsibility for it. And just because it happened in the past doesn't mean that the current corporation should not make good on their responsibility.
It's exactly why the Superfund was created, right? Was so that if you have this change in ownership, corporate mergers, which there are a lot of in the railroad industry and all this stuff, no, you still put money into a fund and that still pays to clean it up. You know, environmental racism is a real thing. Many people of color, many lower income folks find themselves living in older communities. I personally really like older housing. I like that character, but the reality is that the environmental laws were different back then, the activities were different then, and there's this legacy, and somebody's got to clean it up.
Well, it's responsibility, and you just can't expect them to to neglect how many persons were affected by this.
Yeah.
And I've lived, of course, have lived in that community for a number of years. When I first came to Kansas in 1990, of course, I lived in the 67214 zip code area, and then 67208, and in that area quite a bit. And so to once going along the canal there on I-135 and to see oil seeping from that drainage area, you're thinking, my God, you know, it's someone has to take accountability and responsibility and do the right thing from a humanitarian standpoint.
Now, a motion to dismiss these days is almost kind of pro forma. It pretty much happens all the time. It doesn't mean that this case is going to be dismissed yet. A judge still has to look at it and make a ruling. And both sides have argued their case. At this point, we're waiting to hear what the judge says.
But I just think it's egregious for Union Pacific to even to ask for such forgiveness, or you know, it's, as you would say, unconscionable. It really is.
No. All right. Well, Kansas state law is frustrating Tesla owners who say if they need their car worked on, they have to drive hours to get it. We go back to Cake's Jocelyn Schiffer-Decker to break down this problem.
I love the car. I don't think I would ever drive another car again. I'm sold on Tesla.
Sold on Tesla, just want it to be more accessible to own a Tesla in Kansas.
Yes.
About 7 months ago, Rod Lloyd from Sterling decided to buy a Tesla, not knowing all the obstacles he'd face because of where he lives.
I wanted to test drive a Tesla, but the closest service centers, the first nearest is Kansas City, Missouri.
That's 220 miles away, and it's where he and other Tesla owners have to go anytime they need their car serviced. One Tesla owner in Derby says his door handle is broken and has been for weeks, but he doesn't have the time to drive 3 hours to get it fixed.
They all say, we wish we had a service center in Wichita.
While there's no law against having a Tesla service center in Kansas, the company isn't likely to open one because it's not allowed to sell cars here under current Kansas law. That's why State Representative Brett Fairchild is coming up with a bill to try to change this.
Current Kansas law requires manufacturers to sell their vehicle through a licensed dealer.
Tesla doesn't sell its cars through dealerships, only directly. After hearing Lloyd's concerns, Fairchild is introducing a bill that would allow companies to sell cars in Kansas directly if they're not already being sold and in contract with another dealership.
It is a very narrow bill because it wouldn't apply to very many manufacturers. We're not allowing all manufacturers to sell vehicles.
Jocelyn Schiffer-Decker, Cake News on your side.
It seems like a weird law to begin with. You can't sell directly. You have to go through a dealership. Any ideas why we've got this law in the first place?
I do. I'm a car enthusiast and I follow this. It was written in the 1920s. Also, car dealers do very, very well running for public office.
Good
Partly
point.
because they meet so many people. I'll give you an example. Wichita's own Les Donovan, who, as you know, owns a chain of car dealerships, was a powerful presence in the Kansas Senate for many years. Emporia's Jeff Longbine is a car dealer and also a higher-ranking person in the Kansas Senate. So car dealers do really, really well at getting themselves elected to public office, and it's sort of a protected monopoly in a way, and it goes back to the 20s. The argument made at that time is that without a licensed dealer, you wouldn't get the follow-up service. But there are a lot of ways to service a car these days. And by the way, that Tesla dealership in Kansas City is on the east side of State Line Road. So I think we know what clientele that dealer is directed at.
Missouri?
Well, it's Kansans who drive literally across the street.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, and this is a denial of individual economic liberty. Like, if Tesla wants to sell me a car, I should be able to buy the car. Now, I'm not going to buy a Tesla. I don't make enough money. I'm not trusting that the car is going to work all the time. And also the politics of their owner are not the ones I share these days. But whatever car I want to buy, I should be able to buy it, just like I can buy a Coke or a Pepsi, or I can go to McDonald's, or I can buy whatever cereal I want. I can buy Netflix or Amazon Video. Why can't I buy a car? And also, this law is a good thing because Kansans want to buy Teslas and they ought to be able to buy them. But it ought to be extended entirely because car dealers ought to compete in a market. And would I go buy a car directly from Ford, the manufacturer? Probably not. I go to the Ford dealer. But that should be my choice. And the idea that in the United States of America, there is a protected monopoly for dealers of a particular product, it just doesn't make a lot of sense.
You did bring up one point that I find very interesting is there aren't a whole lot of Kansans who can afford or want to buy a Tesla.
Well, they may want to buy it, but
Well,
it comes down to economics.
Yes, that is
can you
true.
afford
That's
it?
true.
Yeah.
Even if they want to, they can't
afford it?
necessarily afford
Well,
it.
and then is the science, has it really been proven that it's, because what I hear for the price of a battery for one of these vehicles when they go out is pretty substantial as well. I'm talking about $9,000 to $10,000 range. Now, I don't know how true or factual that is, but it's pretty extensive.
Yeah.
Pretty soon they're going to make those in DeSoto, by the way.
That is
That's
true.
what that plant is for.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's supposed to bring Kansas a lot of money. We'll see.
We will see.
Well, turning from travel to school, when should back to school fall? For most Kansas schools, that's sometime in August. Feels like it's coming earlier and earlier in the month every year. But as KSN's Adam Orduna shows us, at least a few lawmakers think we need to push back to school back to after Labor Day.
Newly elected Wichita School Board member Knock Vaughn says he's open to the discussion to start school later.
Pushing it back to September, hopefully addresses some of those heat wave concerns.
In Wellington, the proposal prompting some questions about schedules for both academics and athletics.
Calendar committee would be they would have some challenges to make sure they got all of our events in, and you'd have to look at maybe pushing the start of a season, later.
Representative Bill Riley from Wellington calls this a pro-family legislation. He couldn't talk on camera, but said in a statement, quote, "We are not advocating for a longer summer break or a longer school year." School representatives we talked to said before the idea moves forward, more voices should be heard.
Some people have their routines already year by year, and something like this might upset the apple cart a little bit for some parents or some teachers.
Administrative assistants or other paraprofessionals or other classified staff, and then also students. So prioritizing those voices and the voices of our parents as opposed compared to district leadership.
Here for you, Adam Orduna, KSN News 3.
And one point on all of this is that schools in Kansas don't figure attendance based on number of days in the classroom, but on number of contact hours. So when they say it doesn't require a longer day, a longer year, they're saying we're basically leaving it up to the districts how they would figure all this out.
Two things quickly, Pilar. The first is tourism. This has long been driven by the tourism industry, particularly the Labor Day break. And families are more likely to travel on Labor Day if the kids haven't already started school. Second point, global warming. Many older school buildings do not have air conditioning. And for kids to go to school during the summer in a building without air conditioning in this part of the country is basically off the table now. So part of this is actually being driven by climate change.
But also that in Wichita, where my kids go to school, if they were going to school today, next week, took out pretty much all the in-service days in the fall, I'm still not sure we could finish the semester.
All right, and
now.
we're going to have to leave it there, folks. Sorry, we're out of time. Thanks so much for joining us. Stay safe and have a great week.